Yeah, welcome everyone, and Happy New Year. Noel's got, there's another 5 presentations after this one are scheduled for this year. So, I mean, the beauty of these presentations, it's a way to stay connected on a more regular basis with our members. So, so the next 5 months up to June are full, and you can see what they are on the home page through the events page. And yeah, thanks to Doug and Noel for setting this up. I mean, we're very lucky with Zoom. We've got a much broader range of speakers than just Sydney-based. And Desmond, like a lot of the others in Canberra, yeah, we're very fortunate to have access to them. There's a lot of excellent naval historians in Canberra. If you've missed any of the presentations, the videos are available on the through the research page of the website. But we're conscious that they're not that easy to find, and we're just looking for better ways to make it more accessible or more visible. But anyway, it's a matter of going into the research page, looking at the videos, and then you'll find our YouTube channel, and that's where they are. Yeah, the last 2 years, I guess, we kept saying next year will be better, but I just hope that 2022 will be better for the society. We've had to cancel lots of events over the last couple of years, and our great plan this year is to develop and run some cruises on the harbour. And the first one, the pilot, is set for 25th of February. And as I said in the email yesterday, we'll provide more information on that and tell members how they can book as soon as we get the webpage set up. And obviously there's lots of risks with that, with COVID and people going into isolation at short notice. So there'll be some conditions on it. But hopefully we'll get our numbers. We've got to make minimum numbers to pay for the boat. So there's a few conditions, but we're optimistic. It's a good product and it'll be very interesting. But that's about all for me. Noel, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, David. And Happy New Year to everyone. I'll repeat what I said before. If you have a presentation or you know of somebody that would like to join this program, please get them in contact with me. But we're ready to go here now with Desmond. As I mentioned before, he was on the program last year and gave an excellent presentation on the battles of the Atlantic. And after a total of 45 years in the Royal New Zealand Navy, the Royal Navy, the British Army and the RAN, this is a man who knows a thing or two and an extensive experience. So without any more ado, over to you, Desmond.
Thanks. I'm just screen sharing now. Falklands War 1982, a perennial subject for study at staff colleges. And indeed, I started teaching this down at the Royal Australian Naval College in succession to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Tom Lewis, who's online as we speak. So let's make a start. Operation Corporate. British operational names are chosen not out of any sense of media awareness, but just because they're the next name on the list in Whitehall. So Corporate it was. Let's look at just how far away from anywhere else the Falklands are. There they are there, and there's Argentina, New Zealand, Canberra, South Africa, and way over the horizon is the UK. So before history comes geography, we always have to remember that. If we want to understand what happened in 1982, we have to go back to 1965, end of empire. The Fleet Air Arm had been a crucial part of providing the means by which British forces could be withdrawn from Africa and from Aden and from any other place safely. And of course, by 1965, end of empire was pretty much a fact. But carrier strike power had provided the means by which the withdrawal could be safely achieved. However, once that was over, Britain decided, or at least the UK government of the day decided, that experience and study have shown that only one type of operation exists which carriers and carrier-borne aircraft would be indispensable. That is the landing or withdrawal of troops outside the range of land-based air cover. Note that phrase, we'll come back to it. It's only realistic to recognize that we, unaided by our allies, could not expect to undertake operations of this character in the 1970s, even if we could afford a larger carrier force. So said Dennis Healy the Secretary of Defense in his Defense White Paper in 1966. The carrier that had been planned, CVA-01, HMS Queen Elizabeth, there she is, was cancelled when her out-of-area role outside the North Atlantic was given to the Royal Air Force's future F-111s, which were in fact never bought. So there was a gaping hole in the British order of battle. The ships that could have filled it, if they'd been refitted, were sent off to the breakers. There's HMS Eagle going off in 1972, a perfectly capable aircraft carrier, but no one had an interest in maintaining them. Bulwark had become a commando carrier. She was paid off without replacement in 1980 and left to deteriorate prior to scrapping. And her reactivation was seriously considered in 1982 for service in the South Atlantic, but by then the SAS had been allowed to use her for bomb practice. And of course, the crown jewels of the fleet, HMS Ark Royal, the last true British strike carrier, was withdrawn in 79, just 3 years before she was needed for corporate. Had she still been in commission in 82, with her Buccaneers and Phantoms, she might have deterred the invasion of the Falklands. We'll never know, but there's a fairly good chance of that. So what happened in 1981 was John Knott, the merchant banker who was the Secretary of State for Defense, put in a review. The Americans only wanted the British to retain an ASW capability in the North Atlantic for helping to get whatever needed to move to the Central Front across. And so he decided that that meant that frigates and destroyers were surplus to requirements. And Invincible, the new ship, was to be sold to Australia with a package of Harriers. Hermes, Fearless, Intrepid were called outmoded and unnecessary ships. And as for the Royal Marine Commandos, well, they were unlikely to ever be needed again in the future, and certainly not at sea. Invincible was a less capable ship than the scrapped Ark Royal, for obvious reasons. Ark Royal was a true carrier which could launch from catapults. Hermes, of course, in 1982 became the indispensable platform. Both were for disposal under the Knott Review by 1983. So this was the missing deterrent, an RN strike carrier with airborne early warning, gannets, and long-range interdiction aircraft. Had they still existed, then the whole story of the Falklands would have been different or not at all. Then we sent all the wrong signals. The MOD announced the withdrawal of the only regular presence of the Royal Navy in the South Atlantic, the patrol ship Endurance. That's as an economy measure, as from the end of 82. The UK Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, who himself was an MC from the Second World War, objected, pointing out that it would send all the wrong signals and save only £4.5 million annually. Trivial sum. He was ignored by Sir John Knott, the Secretary of State for Defence, and Prime Minister Thatcher denied that Endurance was important to the security of the Falklands. Captain Courageous, Nick Barker, captain of Endurance, fought not one but 3 wars against the Argentinians, against the complacency and competence and misjudgment in Whitehall, and against the planned scrapping of his own ship. There she is with her little Wasp helicopter. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office continued to send out all the wrong signals. They wanted to get rid of the Falklands. They called them a disposable remnant of empire. And leased back to Argentina was the stated position for the Falklands, regardless of the objections of the people who lived there. President Gautieri, picking up on this, said 1983 will be the year of the Malvinas. And he had every reason to believe that that would be possible, because by then the amphibious out-of-area capability of the Royal Navy would be gone. Admiral Anaya, later, after the war was over, said, "We simply never dreamed that you could send a task force." Miscalculation. The chronology: on the 9th of January 82, the ambassador to Argentina lodges a formal protest against unauthorized landings on South Georgia by Argentine scrap metal merchants Davidoff, who raised the Argentinian flag there. On the 12th of January, the Argentine Joint Forces Committee began planning the invasion. And on the 24th of January, that was leaked in a series of articles in the newspaper. On the 2nd of February, Margaret Thatcher, in a letter to the Conservative Party, made clear that she regarded the Royal Marine presence in Stanley as sufficient to prevent an invasion. Normally, there were only 30. At the time of the invasion, there was a double up, then there was 60 there. And in the 3rd of February, Britain renewed its formal protests about the South Georgia landing. And in the 9th, a few days later, Thatcher confirmed the retirement of Endurance in 1983. And in the 25th of February, the Foreign Minister, Richard Luce, began sovereignty talks with the Argentine counterpart in New York. What's a poor dictator to think? British and Argentine deputy foreign ministers issued a joint communique praising the cordial and positive spirit of sovereignty discussions held in New York. And then on the 2nd of March, the following day, the Argentine foreign minister rejected the communique and said that Argentina reserves the right to employ other means if Britain keeps refusing to cede sovereignty. On the 5th of March, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, decides not to send an SSN to patrol off the islands in South Georgia. Now, this is significant because in 1978, Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, ex-Royal Navy, had sent SSN south, or at least he said he did, and that was sufficient to deter an invasion once it was leaked at the cocktail party circuit in Buenos Aires that there was one there. So invasion day, 2nd of April 82, the Argentines landed. They were strongly resisted by the 60-man garrison of Royal Marines at Port Stanley. This was not going to be a surrender. This was going to be a fight, obviously a completely outclassed fight. 60 Royal Marines fought a 3-hour battle, killing many Argentines. They didn't take a single casualty themselves. They fired over 6,000 rounds before Governor Rex Hunt ordered a ceasefire to save the islanders. The point and purpose of this operation is going to be to preserve the way of life of the islanders. You can't very well do that if they're in a cemetery killed by friendly fire. So Sir Rex Hunt surrendered, but refused to shake the hands of Menendez, the invading general. On Grytviken in South Georgia, there was a 2-hour battle led by Lieutenant Keith Mills, Royal Marines, with his 22 bold booties there. You can see them. Inflicted serious damage on an Argentine corvette with an anti-tank missile. They shot down a Puma, killing 2 Argentine Marines and a sailor, and sustaining only 1 wounded on the British side. So once again, mercifully, small loss of life. These images from Port Stanley angered the British public. Here are Royal Marines lying down on their faces in the dirt in Port Stanley. The House of Commons erupted in fury aimed at Mrs. Thatcher, and that was from her own backbenchers, and at Sir John Knott. And the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, resigned like a gentleman, saying that it had happened on his watch, he couldn't possibly carry on. Sir John Knott offered his resignation, but Mrs. Thatcher decided not to accept it, as it might look like a catastrophe happening in her cabinet. So John Knott goes on. And of course, the Argentinians erupt in patriotic joy in Buenos Aires to the death. The Argentinians were fully in support of the junta's popular invasion of their Malvinas, and Galtieri, from being the most hated man in Argentina, was hailed as a great patriot. So game, set, and match to Argentina. Falklands population were threatened with deportation to Buenos Aires and then to the UK. And it's possible that the only thing that stopped that happening was the fact that there were, in fact, submarines lurking around the Falklands, and they couldn't get ships in safely to get them off, to get the people off. So they were imprisoned. Incompetence and arrogance in a UK Secretary of State for Defence matters, as it does in any democratic government. Sandy Woodward, when he was Director of Naval Plans, rigorously opposed the Knott Review, and he later wrote, John Knott possessed the cold heart of a career banker, not offset by a cool brain of a military man, much less any knowledge of things maritime. And the Secretary of State for Defence, John Knott, in his autobiography said, I had to remind myself where the Falklands were. I went to a globe in the corner of my office. I was a bit horrified to see how far away they were. We didn't have any proper land-based air cover. This from the man who decided to get rid of Invincible, Hermes, and the Fleet Air Arms fixed-wing capability. First Sea Lord Sir Henry Leach takes charge. Mrs. Thatcher and everybody else are being told that it's impossible, it can't be done. Strategy is the art and science of employing the armed forces of a nation or alliance to secure policy objectives by the application or threat of force. Leach said we must be prepared to take losses, but we're not going to lose. The only thing that'll make us lose is if we lose our nerve. And he promised Mrs. Thatcher the option of an RN task force to sail in 3 days to retake the Falklands. She seizes it. Almost all her cabinet are ready to cede the Falkland Islands and its people to Galtieri. She's not. Winter's coming. Sounds like Game of Thrones, doesn't it? 6 weeks before winter starts in the South Atlantic, which makes flying operations and troop landings impossible due to the sea state, the ice, the cold, and the darkness. If Gautieri and Anaya had waited about 2 months, it's hard to see how this could have happened in 1982. Sandy Woodward, former Director of Plans, is appointed Task Force Commander. He's got an immediate priority. There are 2,000 Falkland Islanders who are captive in their homes or in various village halls, and they're likely to be deported to Argentina unless the task force could prevent it by air and sea blockade. Woodward is, of course, a submariner. He's teacher, and so SSNs go down south fast and first because they can, as he said. So there are 4 SSNs now blockading the battle space. Speed, stealth, intelligence gathering, that's what they do. And of course, they also have the capability to land Royal Marine Special Boat Service to do their reconnaissance of enemy positions. Not much talked about the SBS, but every bit as significant when you're playing these kind of games as the SAS. Down they go. And they start scoping places for landings. 2 carriers in the Fleet Air Arm leave UK. The British public want to see these islands recovered, but many of them have no idea where they are. Most people thought they were somewhere in the Scottish Hebrides. They're not keen on British going to a shooting war where their troops are going to be killed. But of course, Mrs. Thatcher's fate and government depends on swift success in the South Atlantic. Now, the planning commences. The Falkland Islanders have declared on shortwave radio their fierce resistance to the invasion or deportation before they were silenced. That's important. To restore them to freedom is going to take a logistical operation of huge risk and great potential for failure, but the alternative is Britain not being able to hold its place up in the world, and the world is watching. So ships are gathered from all over the place, and ships are released from the Beira Patrol and gathered either at Gibraltar or directly from UK, and they start sailing south, with Ascension being the first port of call. President Reagan was not convinced that this invasion was important. He'd never heard of the Falklands, and Mrs. Jean Kirkpatrick, the US ambassador to the UN of Irish extraction, was profoundly hostile to the UK and supported Argentina's claim to the Malvinas. She is a serious problem which has to be neutralized in the UN General Assembly. Reagan said he couldn't understand why 2 US allies were arguing over that little ice bunch, cold bunch of land down there. So shuttle negotiations between London and Buenos Aires started with the Secretary of State, former NATO Secretary General Al Haig. They failed because, of course, there was no question of Gautieri withdrawing his troops. That was the only precondition for success of those talks, and he wasn't going to do it. So the task force is sailing south and preparing for war, but most people still didn't believe it was going to come to that. However, Royal Marines, being Royal Marines, to start, got themselves as fit as they could, running round and round Hermes flight deck and getting ready for battle. Political. Well, we've told you already about the Argentinian junta, Colonel Gautieri, an unelected military dictator. He really is a plaything of Admiral Anaya, who is an absolute monomaniac on the subject of the Malvinas. The junta's despotic, inefficient, murderous, feared and hated. It could not withdraw its troops after it had put them there, or it would undoubtedly fall. And of course, Anaya's intention is not only to retake the Falklands, but to unite the Argentinian people and keep the junta in power. That's the bottom line here. About their military, well, their Air Force and their Navy were fiercely loyal to the junta, as you'd expect. They have some modern equipment, but they're not experienced in battle. They haven't actually fought a hot war for over a century. The occupation army that was put in there was never intended to fight. It was a mix of conscripts and some well-trained mountain troops and Marines, and we'll hear more about those later. What about the Argentine Orbat? Well, they've got 1 conventional carrier with anti-ship armed jets and ASW helicopters. They've got the cruiser Belgrano. They've got 15 anti-ship armed frigates and destroyers, and they've got 3 ex-USN diesel-electric submarines, which can't be dismissed. And of course, significantly, the landing force is in place on the islands and is able to equip itself and sustain itself there, mostly from the sheep that roam in their thousands and provide good meat. There's the carrier, an XRN modernized aircraft carrier, angle flight deck, as you see, fast jets with standoff anti-ship missiles, and of course, anti-submarine helicopters. So this is a potent capability. Because Argentina had maintained its long-range fixed-wing strike capability, which the Ministry of Defense had taken off the Royal Navy when Ark Royal was withdrawn and the Buccaneers were given to the Royal Air Force. So in many ways, on paper, that's the most capable vessel down there on either side. Belgrano was USS Phoenix, of course. She was escaped from Pearl Harbor in 41. She's not modernized, but you can't argue with salvos of 6-inch shells landing on your flight deck and ruining your afternoon. It's no point in saying afterwards, but this was an outdated, outmoded attack. It shouldn't have worked. If it works, it works. Also got a couple of British-designed Type 42 destroyers with the new potent Sea Dart anti-air missiles. Now that is a very capable combination. Air Force, 78 Skyhawks, that's a fair old fleet, Skyhawks, 24 Dagger, 18 Mirage, 5 Super 8-ton Dards, one of which you see there in the bottom picture, 6 Canberra bombers, 144 Pucara, which are anti-troop aircraft. They've got 9 C-130 Hercules. So this is not a small air force by any standard. And of course, the Super 8-ton Dart carried a limited number of French Exocet missiles, which, as we all remember, were game changers. They're radar-guided standoff missiles. They can be launched from an 8-ton Dart 70 kilometers away from the target. They're fire and forget. Once launched, their speed made them very hard to hit, and they are ship-killing missiles. The French have done a good job on this missile, and the more of them that the Argentinians have, the more impossible this operation will be. They also had land-based variants of it in silos aimed seaward from the Falkland Islands. They'd got those in there by sea, and they were being placed around the islands, particularly around Port Stanley, which is where the assumed invasion or any attempt to retake the Falklands would come from. About the British or 2 carriers, Invincible and Hermes. Look how small a force of RN and GR3 RAF Harriers they've got, just 21. You don't want to start losing those in any numbers. They've got 12 ASW and 25 transport helos, most of them Sea King Junglies. Highly trained Royal Marine Commandos who are used to operating in Norway in winter. So they're going to be okay, provided you can keep up the resupply to them. And coming south, a mixed bag. 5th Infantry Brigade, which has the Paras in it, and the Gurkhas, good, and Guards coming south. Well, some of these Guards are coming off ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace, state of fitness unknown. There's Invincible. He's a Harrier carrier. He's capable only of local air superiority, not long-range strike. This is not a replacement for Ark Royal. There's nothing as capable as a Buccaneer or even a Phantom in terms of length of range. Though, as we shall see, the Harrier has other advantages in the short-range battle. 25 anti-ship and ASW armed frigates and destroyers, and they're being gathered all the time. They are fitted with the Sea Kings, operating from Invincible, and Hermes are fitted with AEW, Airborne Early Warning, search water radars. You can see one attached to the side of that Sea King. They were fitted very hastily, trying to provide some limited over-the-horizon air threat detection capability, not a replacement for Gammets, which had long range and endurance. These don't. But the Sea Lynx, and the Sea Harrier and the Lynx, decades of British innovation had gone into these aircraft, but of course they're untried in combat. Nobody knows for sure whether a Sea Harrier is going to be able to do the business on the day. But that's the best that the British have got, so they send them south. The really critical thing is Hermes flight, considerably larger than Invincibles, more capable of taking aircraft, and of course, a complete refit capability on board for Sea Harriers. That's the most critical and crucial asset in the entire RN fleet, no question. Carriers are not replaceable. You can lose escorts, they're replaceable, they're expendable, which is not a comfortable thought if you happen to be the manager of one, but you know it. You shouldn't have joined if you can't take a joke. But carriers are not replaceable. Lose a carrier and you're done for. If you lose the air, the operation is over. We may as well all go home. said Sandy. Lose Invincible, the operation is severely jeopardized. Lose Hermes, the operation is over. And the Argentinians know it. Use of force, national intent. Are we really going to get down there and start shooting? Well, Woodward summed it up. I'm not in favor of blowing people's heads off. However, as a loyal servant of my government, if I have to blow people's heads off, I'll do it in the most efficient and effective way I know how. One of the major threats was the limited aircraft handling space and no aircraft replacements. And of course, multiple Royal Fleet auxiliary replenishments at sea are going to be needed. The fleet train is over 8,000 miles from UK. So logistics is going to play into this, and that's going to be the name of the game. When it's all over, Sandy Woodward will say, I wonder if the Argentinians realized if they'd blown on us, we'd have fallen over logistically. There's also, of course, the national capability in the background. Britain in those days still had a merchant marine of some size, and so 50 British flagged ships could be taken up from trade, stuffed, including, of course, the QE2 as a troop transport. There she is heading off from Portsmouth with 5th Infantry Brigade on board. What about the weapons these ships are carrying? Well, you've got Sea Dart, Sea Wolf, Sea Cat, Rapier, which is a shore-based weapon, and of course you've got good old naval guns. Ammunition is finite. Once missiles are gone, the battle will be over, we all go home. So you've got to have some kind of a resupply system for ammunition. Of course, some of the systems are really outmoded. Older British frigates, the Type 12s and the early Leanders, were still equipped with obsolete short-range Sea Cat missile systems. They were wire-guided by a chap using the Mark I human eyeball to put his missile onto an incoming target against Exocet. Pointless operation, they're far too fast. No multi-barreled guns like Phalanx in the Royal Navy in 1982. The Falklands will see those start to arrive. Sea Dart, medium-range surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile on both British and the Argentinian Type 42 frigates. So the British haven't got this all their own way when it comes to having a very potent anti-air missile. Sea Wolf is the missile system most recently developed, and it is capable of taking out an Exocet in flight in theory. It's never actually been done, and nobody knows for sure whether that will work, but that's what it's for. Woodward said, we did not know of one factor which was going to dominate the thinking of the Argentine aviators, their high regard for the effectiveness of the Sea Dart. It caused them to not use the middle and upper air to get below Sea Dart at all costs. This left them with only very low flying, and that will become very significant later. Logistics staff are now at Ascension deciding on operational priorities, and the decision was made to recover South Georgia first because it could be. And of course, US military aid starts to arrive. Cross-decking by helicopters and sorting out of cargo continues. If you sail a task force in 3 days, as per promised, everything's been dumped on board, nothing's been sorted out, so there's no logical order to the way in which supplies are being carried, and the Sea Kings, with underslung loads, moved that stuff around so it was what you needed first was going to be where it was needed. Remember, we're 4,200 miles from UK, 3,800 from the Falklands, but it's vital to the supply of the task force because it's the forward operating base. Americans sent the Sidewinders to Ascension, and that, of course, made the Sea Harrier far more lethal in air-to-air combat than it could otherwise have been. A really significant and important decision by the Americans not to go on playing this silly game that we're supporting our American cousins on the same landmass as ourselves, but to realize that this was going to be a huge problem if Britain didn't get support as a NATO partner. Some vital intelligence. The limited loiter time of only 10 minutes for Argentine strike aircraft flying from the mainland doesn't apply to the carrier, but it does apply to the mainland. So Woodward kept his task force as far to the east as he could and still have Harrier range back to the Falklands. He's on the extreme edge of the Étendarde's strike range, so far to the east that people joked he should get the South Africa medal. But an Argentine Hercules C-130 was landing with cargo and aircraft and troops, mostly conscripts, being flown in on a routine basis. That has to stop. So, the longest British bombing mission in its history was with multiple refuelings, was called Exercise or Operation Black Butt. RAF Vulcan bombers, also slated for disposal, as they no longer carry the British nuclear deterrent, was sent to the Ascension Island and started to plan to hit the crater the runway at Port Stanley. That's the point and purpose of their being there. It's a hugely complex operation. It needs multiple refuelings, as you see in the picture there, from tanker aircraft. And it just underlined once again that proper land-based air cover sounds good if you don't understand the sheer logistical complexities of achieving anything at any range. You could have done exactly what was done to Port Stanley multiple times from buccaneers if they'd been there. But of course, there's nothing there that has that capability. Now, the single crater that was produced on the runway deterred C-130 reinforcements from operating from Stanley as far as we know. It didn't prevent Étendards and Skyhawks from going there because it was too short for them anyway. So that wasn't an issue. There you see one lonely crater on the Port Stanley runway. So it was a tactical failure, but it was a strategic success. And you could argue that it showed national intent, that this wasn't going to be something that was just going to be let go by default. 4 SSNs, of course, are far more potent. They're deployed individually, south, east, west, and north, and then in a blockade line off our Argentinian airfields. And they're, of course, providing real-time intelligence to the UK, to Northwood in UK, and to the task force commander. Absolutely vital. So who's who in this organization? Well, Major General Jeremy Moore, Royal Marines, is the ground force commander. Tough, seasoned, intelligent, humane, wise, an ideal choice. He develops the understanding of the strategic plan, and it's his concept of operations that Northwood are going to go with. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, back at Northwood, provides command from GCHQ and Northwood, and he provides statements of intent, which come down from the politicians, and he also provides real-time facts about enemy capability. One of the plans that was put forward and got a name, so it must have had some degree of credibility, was Operation Mercado. It wasn't an SAS idea, they opposed it, but it was proposed that they should go in by air and assault the Rio Grande Air Base, where the Super Étendard and other Argentine pilots were, kill them in their beds in the officers' mess, and destroy the last of the exocets. Well, many of them wrote their wills when they heard about that. It was cancelled due to the impracticality of it. It wouldn't have worked. And also the huge ethical and international public relations consideration. It was a disaster averted. It was a risk that was unreasonable, and it would have absolutely destroyed, even if it had failed, the British moral high ground. And that's an important factor that everyone has to retain if they're going to retain the public relations debate. So the Argentine Navy deployed 1 aircraft carrier at sea with helicopters and aircraft, notably armed with Exocet, the frigates, 3 diesel-electric submarines, land-based strike aircraft in support of the fleet, 1 cruiser, 2 destroyer flotilla to the south, 2 destroyers, and the carrier Vicente Mayo to the northwest. What's the plan? Well, overall, gain a foothold on the land away from Port Stanley. Don't try and take Port Stanley in a frontal assault. Everybody's going to get killed. The point and purpose will be lost. The 2 carriers and the logistic ships to support them to remain together to the east of the island group as far out of air range as possible, hence the South Africa Medal, and achieve air superiority over the Argentine Air Force. Easy to say, but hard to do with 21 Harriers. And of course, neutralize any ship assets threatening this situation. What's the strategic plan for the landing? We'll get the SBS in there first to see what's what and where you can go without having to do an opposed landing. Sabotage and intelligence gathering. You've got to land that landing force within 3 weeks due to weather, logistics, and fatigue. People can't just be left bobbing around at sea and be expected to be capable of doing the business. Once they're there, they've got to be used. Protect the landing force once it is ashore with Harriers, yes. Ship missiles, yes, limited number of those. Rapier batteries ashore and ship's guns. And the weakest point I've already mentioned, Sandy Woodward can't afford to lose even 1 carrier because that would mean too few Harriers to run a combat air patrol over the task group, no ability to pursue Argentine aircraft or protect his ships. So, to avoid the risk of mine warfare in the neck of San Carlos water, he asked a couple of frigate captains to stooge around there the night before and see if they let off any mines. He said he'd prepared their citations for medals if they did. Fortunately, there were no mines there, but no mine sweepers either. Meanwhile, in South Georgia, HMS Endurance, pretending to be an iceberg, keeping close to them, avoiding radar detection, while she's keeping London informed of enemy intent. The operation was called Paraquet, known to everyone as Paraquat, the retaking of South Georgia, and of course it was all launched from Ascension Island. The Argentinians knew it was going to happen. They sent the Santa Fe over there with reinforcements, and she was crippled off South Georgia by an ASW Wessex that caught her on the surface and dropped depth charges, one of which bounced on her casing and then didn't explode. And Wasp helicopters, of all things. The Wasp helicopters were flying from Antrim and Plymouth, and I think from Endurance. First and only time an Aryan Wasp helicopter has ever engaged an enemy. Usually they only move the mail, a bit of beer, and senior officers around, but they do have an anti-ship missile capability, and they used it, known as flying bedsteads, one of the most extraordinary episodes in the whole story. Fortuna Glacier was at the back of the area where the Argentine troops were, and D Squadron of the SAS, against the instructions of the Royal Marine Commander on the spot, decided that they'd land on the glacier and take the Argentinians from the rear. Well, this was a doomed enterprise, and it caused them to crash of two Sea Kings. Wessex, and one Wessex was left to get them all out. The most overcrowded Wessex in history, lifted everybody off. There were no fatalities, but it could have been a complete disaster. Don't over-egg the pudding. It wasn't necessary. That was not the only way in which you could affect the aim, which was a surrender. The real way to do it, of course, was to demonstrate naval gunnery. A shore bombardment from the Royal Navy frigate Plymouth and the destroyer Antrim onto a waste piece of ground, informing the Argentinians that if they didn't surrender, the next one wouldn't be a demonstration of beyond their position, and the white flags went up fairly promptly. No need for SAS heroics at all. Lieutenant Commander Astiz surrendered South Georgia. He was a criminal mass murderer of Argentine women and abductor of babies. He'd been running the Navy apprentice school as a torture center for years, where babies were born to detain women. The women were then, with their husbands, taken out to sea and dropped from helicopters. That kind of fellow. Retaking of South Georgia by Royal Marines was probably strategically irrelevant, but it was absolutely critical for the Prime Minister back in Britain to be able to point to some measure of success. And with typical sang-froid and British aplomb, the signal went back, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen." So things are definitely looking up for the British public. South Georgia was the first victory. There's Mrs. Thatcher standing next to Sir John Knott outside number 10. He's the man who had aimed to disband the entire 3-Commando Brigade, Royal Marines and others. And Mrs. Thatcher said to the media, when they asked for further information about what had happened, "Just thank God and the Royal Marines." One wonders what was going through Knott's mind. A TEZ is a very useful thing. Tell everybody, don't come in or you'll be treated as an enemy. And the UK declared a 200 nautical mile TEZ around the Falklands. All ships entering would be regarded as hostile. There was no guarantee that ships outside the TEZ would be left alone. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what then happened. So you've got the carrier Vincenti Mea with her escorts coming down from the north. You've got Belgrano and 2 escorts coming up from the south, and the task force is in the claws of a pincer. Conqueror is in place to take out Belgrano. Superb and Spartan are not yet within range of Vincenti Mea. Otherwise, Woodward said he'd have asked for them to engage and sink them as well. But he's got to do something about one of these claws. There's an Argentine tracker aircraft flying from the carrier, and they were only deterred because they realized they'd been caught on radar and their missions were aborted. Otherwise, there would have been Exocet attacks on the 1st and 2nd of May. Note how useful trackers are in giving you battle space, real-time understanding of what's going on. So the pincer, he needed to remove a claw. The cruiser squad was in place. Conqueror was in position to do it, but he needed a change to the rules of engagement in order to be allowed to sink Belgrano. Mrs. Thatcher is at her weekend retreat at Charters. She's contacted, she approves the rule of engagement, and Conqueror is now ready to fire. What do you fire at a World War II cruiser? Well, you probably don't fire your latest torpedoes. Most of the time they don't work. You fire the good old-fashioned World War II torpedoes, which you know will explode, go bang. And so 360 Argentine sailors were dead, many of them because they had not been in a proper war state. They were a cruising state with many of the red openings open to the sea when it poured in. So many of them drowned on board, others drowned in their life rafts or died of cold before they could be picked up. A lot of UK citizens were very surprised and shocked at this Triumphalist Sun headline, and in no time questions were being asked about whether or not it was ethical to fire on a ship that was outside of the TEZ. And of course, the Argentine newspapers' propaganda goes wild. There's a fake news image of Invincible burning, of course, just completely made up. And Mrs. Thatcher with a pirate's patch over one eye. This is being treated as a terrible thing to have done. Well, is it? In war, the opportunity to sink one of the enemy's major units comes rarely, and a commander who does not take advantage of such a chance should not be responsible for the lives of troops and sailors. The Falklands War began when Argentine forces landed on the islands and fired on British soldiers. Belgrano's destruction was just as legitimate as that of Bismarck, which was also steaming towards a port when it was sunk. And indeed, the captain of the Belgrano confirmed that he regarded the whole thing as an act of war, perfectly legitimate. In fact, he said that the fact that we happened to be pointing towards Argentina does not mean that we were out of the picture. We were probably going to be tasked with coming around and joining the northern pincer. So the consequence of this, the SSN attack on Belgrano by Reeford in Conqueror demoralized the Argentinian Navy. They knew there were other submarines out there. So their surface warships didn't sail more than a few miles from Argentina's coastline for the rest of the war, and that played Vincente Mayo and the capability she had for interfering in British plans right out of the picture. That's significant. That matters. Single Exocet fired from a Super 8 Andard 6 miles off Sheffield, hit her in the ops room, started a fire which destroyed the ship's ability to fight, and it killed 23 sailors. Textbook use of Exocet. That's exactly what that missile was designed by the French to do. Sheffield was being used in the absence of planets or their replacement as the uprange goalkeeper. That was the phrase that was used. And she was abandoned and sunk under tow on the 4th of May. The UK public was very shocked by the loss of 23 British sailors killed. Not surprisingly, it reminded people that this was real. This was not something that was happening in the UN General Assembly or in shuttle diplomacy. Real people were getting killed, including our sailors. And the problem was, as the CO of 8-1 Squadron said, in spite of air supremacy established by the Task Force for Fighters, it was still not possible for us to achieve airspace denial 24 hours a day. Simply weren't enough pilots and aircraft to achieve that. So now both navies have lost ships and they've lost lives. This thing is coming down to a test of national will and naval capability to maintain operations as the winter approaches. It's going to be a near-run thing, whichever way you look at it. There's the 200-mile nautical zone. There's General Belgrano and where she was sunk. There's Ascension Island. The arrival on the 21st of April at South Georgia and the 22nd at the Falklands. Just tells you how far away from Ascension Island these places are. Now, there's a potent threat ashore on Pebble Island. Remember those Pucara aircraft I told you about? They are very capable of interfering from the islands with any shore-based landing. They have to be dealt with. It's a very hard task for naval gunfire to hit, such small targets, you could rain shells down on an airfield and not guarantee that you've taken out all the Pucara. So this is a use for the SAS. This is what they're good for. This is their historic operation, blowing up Rommel's aircraft in rear areas in the desert. So they go in and do that operation, and they destroy every one of those aircraft. Those Pucara are all taken out without a single loss of an Argentinian life. It's a preparation for the invasion, absolutely necessary to minimize the enemy's capability to interfere with your plans. All were destroyed. Where to go? Well, obviously not Port Stanley. You've got to have somewhere with calm water, so it's got to be protected. It can't be an open beach. Somewhere that you're not anticipated, and somewhere where the hills around it offer protection for ships from Exocet and calm water for the watercraft. So San Carlos is chosen. You see the narrow neck of land there. Now there's an Argentine gun emplacement and an Exocet emplacement on Fanning Head. It's a mobile gun emplacement. That has to be taken out. That has to be dealt with. That's a potent threat. Intrepid and Fearless, the two landing ships that the Royal Marines have called home for nearly 20 years by that stage, saved from destruction at Mr. Knott's hands. They go in, both of them are there. And of course, they are docks with watercraft able to take people ashore in safety. Canberra goes in to San Carlos. Concentration of Royal Marines needed to be cleared ashore at speed to prevent potential catastrophe. Risk in war cannot be eliminated, but it must be managed. And Canberra came under attack. She was firing general purpose machine guns from her bridge wing, a bit of a contrast with her usual role as a cruise liner, but it had to be done. And of course, she was only left there for the length of time necessary to get people down the side and into watercraft and ashore. She is at anchor, guarded by a Seawolf armed frigate. So the landings go in. Prior to that, at dawn, the Argentine positions on Fanning Head had been absolutely pounded by suppressing naval gunfire. No earlier than dawn, you don't want to give the game away as to where the landing is going to happen, but at dawn, look at the number of empty 4.5-inch casings that have been fired by that single gun. And that, of course, is attriting the ammunition supply. So in they go, with their green berets on, God bless them. And of course, it's reported back in Britain, British troops go in, and Time magazine, D-Day in the Falklands. What the problem was is that, of course, as soon as they were ashore, the Argentines knew exactly what was going on. And the Navy now has to absorb the air attack to defend the troops ashore, otherwise they'll become the target. And these ships, as I said to you before, lack close-in tracking weapon system for point defense. All ships' upper deck sailors were firing blowpipe, shoulder-launched missiles, and general-purpose machine guns at the incoming Mirage and Skyhawks, partly to attempt to deter them and partly to give them something to do other than wait for the attack. There they are, World War II era anti-aircraft guns firing at low-flying aircraft. Better than nothing, but nothing like as good as a phalanx. Argentine Skyhawks attacked the Type 21s. They seem to know that Type 21s are very vulnerable ships and will burn. And they were very brave pilots. They're coming in low and they're attacking at speed and from different directions simultaneously, as you do. One-shot ships, the old Type 21s, they're not intended to absorb punishment. There's Ardent with a UXB in her side and her shattered stern. Fortunately, the Argentinians were coming in very low and their bombs weren't fusing properly. The Rapier batteries ashore were a disappointment. They were all right for an aircraft coming towards them, but if the aircraft was flying away, the Rapiers were too slow to catch a retreating Mirage or Sky. So their much expected capability for defending the ships in the harbor and the landing zones just doesn't materialize. You've got to have the most recent equipment. Rapier are getting too old, they're too slow for what they're up against. So what they did was they sent Harriers ashore, PR-3s, the Royal Air Force Harriers, operating from a base ashore near to San Carlos, defending the fleet from the land. That's a much better idea. But things just go wrong. Antelope was bombed and she was sunk. 22 RN sailors were killed and 30 were wounded. and there's the remains of her, a tragedy. And UXB low-flying bombs would have been even more damaging had they been fused correctly for the height they were being dropped from. But they were hitting ships with absolute pinpoint accuracy. There's broadsword's flight deck that's been impacted, but they weren't necessarily exploding. If every Argentinian bomb that had hit a British ship had exploded and done the anticipated amount of damage, it's quite hard to see how the operation could have continued. You can see a hole in the side of a British ship there. Sea Harriers, of course, got into play, coming in from carriers, which were not at San Carlos. They're coming in from over the horizon at speed. They're shooting down Argentine aircraft. And of course, Seawolf missiles were doing it as well. And the Argentine Air Force was taking a terrible attrition in pilots, an awful lot of empty spaces at breakfast in Argentine bases. Seawolf proved itself to be a very useful and capable missile. Coventry and Broadsword were operating as a Sea Dart and Seawolf air defense goalkeepers. The theory being that if you had Seawolf and Sea Dart together, you could take out the middle air and the higher air. But unfortunately, Coventry was sunk after an A4 Skyhawk came in and hit it with 3 old-fashioned 3,000-pound bombs. This was a tragedy. Human error and equipment failure combined to cause it. The lock that Broadsword had for her Seawolf on the incoming aircraft was broken, and the seat, when Coventry turned across her bow to minimize her profile, and Coventry's Sea Dart lock was broken when the aircraft came in low and was disguised by aircraft. And the consequence was that Coventry was sunk. Hermes, of course, was under constant threat from standoff missiles, and knowing this was the case, she fired chaff to divert an Exocet. Chaff is the radar confuser which you can put into the air, and it confuses, but it doesn't bring down an Exocet. The chaff saved Hermes from a certain strike, but Atlantic Conveyor with troop lift Chinook helicopters took the pain instead. There she is being escorted by a Type 52. She was hit by the Exocet aimed at Hermes, and she was destroyed, as you'd expect. Exocet is always going to take out a thin-skinned vessel like that. There she is when she was flying off the Harriers. Fortunately, they'd all been got off. And then she burned and sank with the Chinooks that she still had on board. That's a blow. Chinooks are very capable troop carriers and ammunition carriers and underslung load carriers. You need them for this operation. So with her gone and with her supplies and all but one of the troop lift Chinooks gone, Woodward and Moore had to improvise heavy lift, logistical and troop movement. There's the last of the Chinooks that was on board Atlantic Conveyor before she was hit. So what's going to happen? Well, yomping's going to happen. Yomping is a Norwegian word for moving, manpower moving across snow. Royal Marines pick it up, and the word they use is yomping. I was often told that I was bimbling when I should be yomping. It's a heavy-duty walk that gets you to where you need to go, carrying what you have to carry. And one of the books written about it is called The Yompers, with 4-5 Commando in the Falklands War. Yomping is the name of the game. Not everybody is up to yomping. It requires endless amounts of practice and fitness and toughness to yomp for any great distance. This is what's going to happen. From San Carlos, across to Teal Inlet, over to Douglas, and down to Port Stanley. The northern route is the Royal Marines route. The southern route is the Paras and 5 Infantry Brigade. The first target, of course, being Goose Green. This is where the land battle took place. 114 islanders are captive in Goose Green in the village hall. If they're killed in the battle, then the point and purpose of this operation is over. There are only a couple of thousand of them on the entire island, and 114 of them would be a tragedy. This war is about the survival of the islanders and the right to live under the flag of their choice. There's Chris Keeble, second in command to H. Jones, and there's the plan of attack from the start line down to the schoolhouse, which is the object of the exercise. RAF GR-3 Harriers flying from invincible bomb goose green troop positions to allow the Argentinians to know that they're in trouble, soften them up. Airstrike is an indispensable force multiplier. It provides protection for troops, and that's what was done for the Paras prior to the attack at Goose Green. But the Argentinians had dug themselves in well. This was not easy. As soon as they arrived at the start line, they started meeting resistance from the trenches that were dug there. And Colonel H. Jones at a certain point realized that he was losing momentum. Shoulder-launched anti-tank missiles with tracer were used to attempt to clear trenches, but well-dug-in trenches are hard to hit with Milan. They're really intended for anti-armor capability, not anti-troops in the ground. So Jones seizes a submachine gun, calling on those around him. He charged the nearest enemy position, firing into enemy trenches. He'd gone past a trench that still had men in it. They turned back towards him, fired onto him, and killed him. Seeing this, the whole of Para rose, and they attacked the enemy with vigor, with bayonets and bullets, and until the Argentinian morale collapsed. And Goose Green was then taken without a single Falkland Islander's life being lost. And not surprisingly, Jones's reward for that act of supreme courage was a VC, but he was only one of 18 Paras killed in action during the Falklands, 14 of them killed along with them at Goose Green. And Carlos water is still being bombed by courageous and dangerous Argentine pilots, so troop landings there are clearly now not impossible, not only not wise, but not possible. So somewhere else has to be found. A landing site close to Port Stanley is needed, 5th Infantry Division. Also, 5th Infantry Division consists of men who are not capable of yomping all the way from San Carlos all the way to Port Stanley. Somewhere nearer to Port Stanley was needed, and Bluff Cove was chosen. And you can see down there where Stanley is, you can see where Bluff Cove is, and you can see that troops are coming in from San Carlos by sea in order to give them the shortest possible distance via Mount Challenger and Mount Kent down to Stanley. That is the plan. Logistic ships landing, logistic, the Galahad and Sir Tristram came in, and they were bombed at Bluff Cove by Skyhawks coming across from the mainland. And they were both set on fire. Now there's Sir Galahad burning in Bluff Cove after the bombing. 48 men were killed, including 32 Welsh guards. How did this happen? What was the problem? The problem was that Royal Marine Major Ewan Southern Taylor, very experienced Falkland Island dweller, could not get a Welsh Guards major who'd never been near the place in his life to put his men ashore before the ammunition and other equipment went ashore. Tragedy inevitably followed. They were the same rank, both majors, but we in the Navy always took the view that a Royal Marine Major was at least one rank higher than a Lieutenant Commander. And if this Welsh Guards Major had shut up and listened to what Sotheby Taylor was saying, he'd have got those men ashore. The ships would still have been hit, but the level of loss of life would have been far less or negligible. So the failure to heed the voice of experience is significant. War is not a training exercise. You have to do things in war you wouldn't do in an exercise. Sea Harriers arrived over Bluff Cove and they shot down 3 Skyhawks in 5 minutes. Pretty substantial example of air superiority in a local area being achieved. We have to have a word about what's going on back at Ajax Bay. A sheep station, sheep pen, had been converted into a field hospital at Ajax Bay. Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly was in charge there. There were bombs in the roof where he was operating, unexploded bombs. He ignored those and kept on operating. No life was lost at Ajax Bay, either British or Argentine. If you could get to Ajax Bay, you lived, and then you could be got out to Uganda. And Rick Jolly has the unique distinction of being decorated by both sides for what he did at Ajax Bay later in his life. And the battles of attrition start. These are battles in the mountains. And of course, this is not where the conscripts are. They're still back in Stanley. The Argentine Marines are up there. They're mountain troops. They're used to exercising against the Chileans up in the Andes. They're not fools, and they're well equipped. They have to be taken on and defeated by the incoming British forces, both Royal Marines, Paras, and Gurkhas. Mount Challenger, Mount Tumbledown, Sapper Hill, these are objectives which became well known in British parlance back in the UK. In the upper hand was important, because without that, the thing would turn into a long, protracted siege, and that would not play well for the British, who were, after all, at the end of their logistical chain of supply. The Scots Guards took a night battle onto Mount Tumbledown, and John Kisley told me that we went in with butt, boot, and bayonet. It was a bloody engagement. John Kisley led the charge up the mountain. His father had given him an old World War II brass compass, and he felt a thump in his chest halfway up the mountain. And later, when it was all over, he looked down to see what the thump was, and a spent round had impacted on the compass that his father had given him. If it had been a plastic silver compass, he wouldn't have survived. And that was a grim affair. And Two Sisters, where the Royal Marines went in, they had the advantage of naval gunfire support through the night. They were calling it in from Glamorgan and other ships with pinpoint accuracy, placing 4.5-inch shells exactly there where they were needed to soften up the opposition. It still wasn't easy, but without that naval gunfire support, it's pretty hard to see how that night attack could have succeeded as swiftly as it did. It would have been a protracted battle with many more Royal Marines losing their lives. So you can see the shells coming in there just where they wanted. They fought and won, assisted by NGS. Accurate barrage fire all night to 3 Commando Brigade. But there was a price to pay. Morgan hung around too far doing what was necessary, and a land-based Exocet at dawn took out her flight deck, exploded in the hangar, or just near the hangar there. 14 sailors were killed below decks. The ship was saved by a very skillful turn by the CO, which avoided him taking a broadside strike as Sheffield had. Was very prompt damage control, firefighting, saved the destroyer. She sailed to fight another day, but she'd done what was needed on the day of the race for the Royal Marines. It was a tragedy. Another 14 Royal Navy sailors lost their lives to an Exocet, but the ship was saved. 3 Para go into Mount Longdon. And again, it's a night battle because that makes perfect sense. Again, a tough battle. 3 Para deserve a great deal of credit for this. 2 Para had taken on Goose Green, 3 Para take on Mount Longdon. Another bloody engagement on the top of the hill with Marines resisting all the way. Never give anybody credence who says that the Argentinians didn't know how to fight. Their well-trained troops did. Mount Longdon, Sergeant Mackay, with complete disregard for his own safety, continued to charge the enemy position alone. On reaching it, he dispatched the enemy with grenades, thereby relieving the position of beleaguered 4 and 5 platoons who were able to redeploy with relative safety. He did this after a couple of privates had been killed next to him. He, of course, was killed at the moment of victory. That's his citation, and there's his Victoria Cross, and of course, there's 3 Para burying their dead the next morning. But Stanley is now in sight, and Argentine troop missiles can come under fire, which certainly shakes up the conscripts who've never seen anything like that. If they weren't frightened before, they certainly were now. And the last battle was for the immediate high ground above Port Stanley. And by this time, the Blues and Royals of the Household Cavalry have got their scimitars ashore. They've clanked them across, and they're, of course, light enough to operate on the fields there, the tundra, if you like, and they're now firing on Argentine troops, giving troops some protection. So that's the night battle for Wireless Ridge above Port Stanley. The Royal Marines and the Paras go into Port Stanley, and the Argentine troops there surrender to them pretty quickly. The conscripts have been neglected and abused by their officers. A Royal Marine warrant officer had an Argentine officer approach him, and trying to excuse himself for his failure, he said, "Well, look what your country gave me to fight with, this rubbish here, you see, and look at your splendid men." And the Royal Marine, who by this stage had worked out what had been going on, stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, sir, it isn't a question of the quality of the men It's a question of the quality of the officers. Look at you. And he was pointing to this chap who was in neatly pressed fatigues with beautiful trim equipment, and of course, well fed from the stores he'd been raiding from the Port Stanley shops. And he said, look at you and look at my officer. And he pointed to a Royal Marine covered in shit like everyone else. And the only reason you could tell he was the officer is he was the one with the map case. He'd done everything that the boys had done. It isn't a question of the quality of the men, it's a question of the quality of the officers. Says it already. These blokes were badly mistreated, living under Wrigley tin out on the airfield. They couldn't expect to fight. That's what happened. The surrender occurred. By this stage, a group of Royal Marines who had been in Port Stanley when it was taken brought ashore, and they are there to actually help the surrender. The Royal Marines in Paris searching conscripts. You see green and red berets there. You must remember that Royal Marines only accept one beret as being the equivalent of the green beret, and that's the red beret of the Paras. And the Paras only accept one beret as being their equivalent, and that's the Royal Marines green beret. Menendez surrendered to General Moore, and he was guaranteed his troops would be returned to Buenos Aires, which indeed happened. Moore meets the liberated Falkland locals, and the flag was raised at Government House by the garrison that had had to surrender there. That was significant. That was undoing the wrong that had been done by having to cause them to surrender. So defeat looks like that, surrendered conscript and by the acre. Victory looks like that, raising the flag, honor regained. Hermes comes back to Portsmouth, looking the worse for wear, but a magnificent welcome awaiting for her. And she becomes, of course, the obvious acknowledgement of the fact that air power at sea, indigenous air capability, always matters. You can't conduct out-of-area operations in support of an army or anyone else if you can't fly combat air patrols from ships. It just won't work. The Great White Whale, the SS Canberra, came home to Southampton. A huge welcome from families who were delighted and relieved to see the boys were back. And the number of them that had been killed was relatively small. Conqueror returned to controversy when she flew the submariner's unofficial war flag. The press, both in UK and around the world, had a field day condemning this as an outrageous insult to the men of Belgrano. Not so. It was just a submariner's tradition left over from the days when they'd been called pirates during the First World War. Invincible came back into the Solent. She is no longer for sale to the RAN for obvious reasons. She's just proved her worth. And of course, her sisters, Illustrious and the new Ark Royal, are coming along in support. And Britain will operate 3 Invincible class carriers for many a year to come. Mr. Knott can take a back seat now. Thank you very much. A very warm welcome from the young women of Portsmouth to sailors coming back to the UK. I don't think this had any particular strategic or tactical significance, but it was certainly welcomed by the boys. So what were the material losses? 109 aircraft. It's a lot of Argentinian aircraft. That's most of their Air Force gone. Belgrano's gone. Submarine is gone, Santa Fe, several transport boats, and everything they deployed to the Falklands. All the weapons, all the kit, all the land-based exocets, all gone. British material losses, 2 destroyers, Sheffield and Coventry, 2 frigates, Ardent and Antelope, both Type 21s, 1 LSL, Sir Galahad. Sir Tristram managed to make it back and was later restored. 1 bulk carrier, Atlantic Conveyor, which in years to come contained everything that anybody had ever lost in the British Army. If you asked for something, people said, oh, it must have been an Atlantic Conveyor, which if it had been true, she'd have to have been 6 times the size she really was. 10 Harriers, all lost to ground fire. Not a single Harrier was lost to air-to-air combat, which is really significant when you consider they were taking on Seahawk and Mirage. And the British lost 23 helicopters, and including an entire SAS detachment in one that went down as a result of an Albatross strike. Tragic. National strategy for war at sea we can take out of all that. Is the strategy consistent with our mission and values? Clearly, the SAS mission to murder in their beds Argentine pilots would not have been consistent with our values. Is the strategy feasible, flexible, and sustainable given our strengths and weakness? Well, it was only just sustainable. Is the strategy responsive to opportunities and threats? Are the risks reasonable? If this thing had been asked of the British Armed Forces in July with the winter impacting on the South Atlantic, the risks would not have been reasonable. Rules of strategic planning, maritime. Important ships need defense in depth, always. You can't risk your high-value assets. Submarines need to gather intelligence, they need to patrol, they need to act as hunter-killers. The mere threat of submarines deters the enemy and constrains operations, something that we're in the middle of a debate about in Australia at the moment. Submarines are kept deep by ASW ships and accompanying aircraft. That's important. And of course, as I think I've proved to you, ships are generally under-defended and naval gunnery never dies. No matter how often it's pronounced that you'll never need naval guns again, naval gunnery never dies because it gives you the maximum flexibility with the maximum amount of ammunition. General rules of maritime strategic planning. And this slide I owe to my good friend Tom Lewis, who I believe is listening. Orient to the threat axis. Where will the threat come from? Where or what is the enemy's center of gravity? Is it actually military or is it political? First achieve air superiority, then air supremacy if you can. Land where the enemy isn't. Remember Dieppe, remember D-Day. Gain maximum intelligence before you launch hostility. There are enough surprises waiting for you without failing to pick up on what you can know. Protect your platforms, there'll never be enough. And without going into detail, remember the principles of war. Reason why. This was a preventable war, completely unnecessary. It was caused by failure to communicate national intentions clearly and in time. It was caused by the national hubris and delusion fostered and exploited by ruthless junta, and was formed by decades of neglect of UK's vital need for out-of-area operating capability. The end of empire did not mean the end of Britain's responsibility to protect people who depended on it and its ability to exercise some power in the world. What was the price of this economy? Well, would the Argentinian task force have been deployed in the face of SSN and AEW vectored air attack from carrier-borne long-range Navy Buccaneers? I doubt it. Long-range air interception, indispensable to maritime operations. San Carlos Water and Bluff Cove would never have come under air attack if the 1970s cancelled strike carriers or Ark Royal and her Phantoms had been armed and guarding the task force. Interception of an Exocet carrying aircraft would have been far to the west of the islands if Ark Royal had been down there. What was the cost of this miscalculation in Whitehall and Buenos Aires? Well, 649 Argentine lives, 253 UK service lives, 3 Falkland Islanders died, about 2.7 billion pounds. Contrast that with the 4.3 million pounds of keeping endurance on station. This is a war that could have been deterred. Ignorance of strategic reality and the need for the right platforms and aircraft in Whitehall. I defer to no one in my admiration for Margaret Thatcher once the war was started, but undoubtedly she could have intervened to prevent it from ever occurring. The false economies and the false messages sent in the defence reviews going all the way back to the 70s, and of course the Knott Review of 81. And of course you can't exonerate the Argentinian ambition and miscalculation from this disaster. What were the consequences? The military junta fell in 82, replaced by civilian government. The dirty war against political dissidents ended. Galtieri served 5 years in prison and died in 2003, still claiming that Britain provoked the war. And the junta had responded to British aggression in 1982. I suppose he believed it. Argentinians all still believe that they own the Falklands and will occupy them within 20 years. That's something that they believed since they were children. Mrs. Thatcher visited this green in 1983, and as a consequence of that victory in the Falklands, she not only won the election of 83, she won 2 more elections after that. Sir John Knott went south to lay a wreath at Port Stanley in 1983. I wonder what was going through his mind. It was the British Cemetery in 2016 and the memorial coin that was struck for it. So lessons learned and scars carried. You can see the scars physically on Simon Weston's face. He was one of the Welsh Guards who was nearly burned to death on Sir Galahad. Lessons learned: willful failure to understand the RN's importance to maritime security along a long succession of UK governments. Heavy price paid for this was the very near wrong thing. One more year of defence cuts and the Argentinian position would have been impregnable. So, for the present, HMS Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales, much opposed in Whitehall by those who didn't wish to see Britain wasting money on aircraft carriers, but they do exist. And without those two decks, with those two decks, UK can once again project maritime power in any part of the world and theoretically deter aggression, as we have seen ourselves. Now they're Stovall, not the equivalent of our Earl's capability for launching from the deck with catapults and traps and cats, but nevertheless, they have very significant capability with the F-35 Bravos on board. And we've seen this year over 30 live intercepts from Queen Elizabeth of armed Russian jets testing the perimeter of the task force in the Mediterranean. She's been carrying the F-35 Bravos, Joint Strike Fighters of the RAF 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, and US Marine Corps in the Mediterranean and the Indo-Pacific. A really significant demonstration of capability. How about us? The Juan Carlos class, which we have, were designed to carry 10 to 12 Harriers or the later Lockheed Martin F-35 Bravos combined with an additional 10 to 12 helicopters. So you get the best of both worlds. The Australian government asked for that fixed wing capability to be removed from HMA ships Canberra and Adelaide before they were built in Spain. The Royal Australian Air Force is going to be acquiring an as yet unknown number of F-35As, possibly up to 75 or even 100 was the original plan. Not a single one of those is going to be able to fly from an RAN deck, unlike the Royal Air Force, who learned in 1982 that if you don't plan to go to sea, you plan to be left out of the operation. There's Canberra doing an Army live shoot from that deck, and there's Adelaide in her role as a helicopter carrier. Nothing wrong with being a helicopter carrier. It's just that these decks were intended for something a bit more significant than just that. There's an RAF F-35B on an RN deck after a combat air patrol. That, I think, is what we should have the capability to do. Combat air patrols, Ripple 3 flying, keep a task force safe around the task force in a way that nothing else can do, certainly not aircraft flying in massive black butts from land bases in the Northern Territory.
2 or 3 questions. Actually, I have one myself. And it goes back to one of Desmond's last slides and about the, one of his early slides, and the strategic and diplomatic blunders which could have prevented it all. Do you see any parallels now with the Russian-Ukraine border and the build-up of Russian forces? The negotiations between NATO and Russia are quite farcical, similar to the ones prior to the Falkland War.
So as a serving officer of the RAN, you would not possibly expect me to have a political comment on anything that's going on at present, but you can very well imagine my thoughts on the subject. Strategic intent and communicating it clearly is absolutely critical to what Biden and Binder are trying to do at the moment. I have developed a considerable understanding and appreciation of the problems of 1938 by watching what's going on in 2022, where you've got a people who speak your language, who consider themselves trapped within another state, as happened with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. You do have an issue. And of course, we all know the Crimea was Ukrainian, but we also know that it was Russian speaking. There are issues that do resolve themselves only if you can think in terms of some modus vivendi whereby people can live the life they choose to within a state without feeling that they are coming under oppression. And there's any number of dictators who are willing to exploit situations, not of their own making, but to their own advantage. And I think Putin's in that camp.
What fantastic slides in great detail. Thank you very much. You've really set the benchmark for 2022. On that note, I think we'll close it. Thanks to everyone, all 61 of you that were attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel. Thank you for letting me have the opportunity to make my points.